New York City never sleeps. Its glass towers stretched into the night sky, glittering like constellations made of money, while below, the streets hummed with a different kind of energy. Delivery bikes darting through traffic, street vendors shouting over the roar of taxis, and the smell of roasted peanuts mixing with perfume that cost more than most people's rent. In the middle of this chaos was Aaliyah Carter, a 28-year-old waitress who knew how to move through the city like a ghost. To the people seated at the white linen tables of the Sterling, an upscale Manhattan restaurant that catered to the rich and self-important, Aaliyah was background noise. She was the girl in black slacks and a pressed button-up, balancing trays of champagne flutes while smiling just enough to seem polite. Customers rarely learned her name. They simply snapped fingers or raised hands, expecting service. To them, she was invisible. But Aaliyah preferred it that way. When you worked 2 jobs, waitressing by night and hustling freelance graphic design gigs by day, you didn't have much energy left for attention. Attention meant questions. Questions meant eyes wandering too close to the part of her life she wanted buried forever. Her co-workers thought they knew her. They knew she was always on time, that she sometimes worked double shifts, and that her laugh was rare but contagious. But what they didn't know was that Aaliyah carried her past like a locked box pressed to her chest. The tattoo etched into her skin was a key, a mark she had spent years hiding beneath layers of fabric, makeup, and silence. It wasn't just ink. It was a scar in disguise. Tonight, the restaurant was louder than usual. A Wall Street banker was celebrating a promotion with his entourage. A Broadway actress sat at the corner booth, pretending not to notice people stealing glances, and Aaliyah weaved through them all, a tray of martinis balanced on her palm. Her steps were precise, almost rehearsed, like a dancer moving across a stage no one had come to see. She passed by a mirror and caught her own reflection, dark brown eyes that always seemed a little too guarded, curls tucked neatly under a bun, shoulders squared like she carried a weight heavier than the tray in her hand. For a split second, she tugged at her sleeve, making sure it hadn't slipped. Relief washed over her when she saw the ink was still hidden. No one could know. Not here. Not ever. And yet, deep down, Aaliyah knew secrets had a way of clawing to the surface. The city was too small, and her past too loud to stay silent forever. She thought she could outrun it by blending in, by becoming invisible in a city of millions. But the truth was waiting, lurking just beyond the glitter of champagne glasses and the noise of laughter. If New York City had kings, Jonathan Blake wore the crown. At 36, he was the billionaire tech mogul who had turned a college dorm room startup into an empire that stretched across continents. His company, Blake Innovations, wasn't just a business. It was a religion in Silicon Valley and Wall Street alike. Power, money, and disruption wrapped into one man's vision. The world saw Jonathan as a titan, 6'3", sharp suits tailored in Milan, the kind of jawline magazines loved to put on their covers. But with his fortune came headlines. Tabloids feasted on his arrogance, his string of failed relationships, and his talent for making enemies at business tables where most men cowered. To investors, he was untouchable. To the public, he was a scandal waiting to happen. Jonathan Blake didn't wait in lines, didn't apologize, didn't settle. If he wanted a skyscraper, he bought it. If he wanted silence, the world hushed. He was the kind of man who looked at a city skyline and thought mine. And yet, behind closed doors, Jonathan's empire felt more fragile than anyone could imagine. Nights alone in his penthouse suite overlooking Central Park often ended in silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of emptiness. He'd drink 20-year-old scotch and stare at the glowing lights below, haunted by the memory of a brother whose shadow he could never escape, and by choices that had carved cracks into the foundation of his empire. For all his arrogance, Jonathan carried something heavy beneath the polished surface, a ghost in his past that no amount of money could erase. It wasn't just that he was ruthless. It was that ruthlessness had cost him more than anyone knew. That evening, he prepared for yet another business dinner, one that promised to secure a merger worth billions. His driver held the door of the black Bentley open, and Jonathan slid inside, adjusting his cufflinks with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. To anyone watching, he looked untouchable, the picture of power. But his mind was elsewhere. drifting to memories he couldn't quite lock away. By the time the car pulled up to the Sterling, the upscale restaurant where the city's elite came to eat and scheme, Jonathan had put his mask back on. The mask of confidence. The mask of control. The mask that made the world bow. Inside, the maitre d' scrambled, investors stood straighter, and whispers filled the room. Jonathan Blake is here. That's what power looked like. An entire restaurant shifting its energy around one man's presence. What Jonathan didn't know, what no one in that restaurant knew, was that the waitress who would serve him tonight was the very person who could shatter his mask. The Sterling was louder than usual that night. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Laughter bounced between marble columns, and the sound of cutlery on porcelain set the rhythm of power. Wall Street elites, Broadway stars, and politicians all dined under the same roof, each one pretending not to care that Jonathan Blake, the Jonathan Blake, had just entered. Aaliyah didn't even look up at first. She was too busy balancing a tray of appetizers, weaving through tables like a shadow. She'd heard the murmurs, though, Jonathan's name floating across the dining room like static electricity. She rolled her eyes quietly. Another rich man in a sea of them. Nothing new. But when she finally glanced up, she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, tailored suit cut to perfection. He carried himself like he owned the room. And maybe he did. The maitre d', practically bent at the waist, guiding him toward his table. "Of course, Mr. Blake. Right this way. Your guests are waiting." Jonathan didn't acknowledge the man with more than a curt nod. His eyes scanned the restaurant instead, like a king surveying his kingdom. When his gaze brushed over Aaliyah, she felt it, sharp, calculating, the kind of look that made her stomach twist. "Don't give him the satisfaction," she told herself, turning back toward the kitchen. Minutes later, fate intervened. Aaliyah was assigned to Jonathan's table. She approached with her practiced smile, placing menus in front of him and his investors. "Good evening, gentlemen. Would you like to start with sparkling or still water?" One of the investors leaned back, smirking at her like she was part of the entertainment. "What do you recommend, sweetheart?" Aaliyah kept her tone professional. "Depends on how much you'd like to spend." The table chuckled. Jonathan didn't. His gaze lingered on her, assessing, dissecting. When she poured the water, Jonathan finally spoke. His voice was smooth, authoritative. "What's your name?" "Does it matter?" she asked without thinking. Her eyes locked on his. A quiet gasp rippled through the table. No one spoke to Jonathan Blake that way. Not investors, not politicians, not even CEOs. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. Jonathan's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It matters to me." "Aaliyah," she said flatly, setting down the last glass. "Pretty name," he murmured, not looking away. For a heartbeat too long, the air between them tightened. Sparks flickered, not warm, inviting sparks, but the sharp crackle of tension, like two storms colliding. She despised his entitlement, the way he looked at her like she was both beneath him and somehow the most interesting thing in the room. He, on the other hand, was intrigued. This waitress wasn't intimidated, wasn't charmed, wasn't trying to impress him. She was different. As Aaliyah turned to leave, she felt his eyes still burning into her back. The Sterling was buzzing with anticipation. Tonight wasn't just another dinner for Jonathan Blake. It was a chess match, one that could secure a merger worth billions and cement his dominance in the tech world. The press had already been whispering that Jonathan was slipping, that his scandals were catching up to him. One wrong move tonight, and those whispers could turn into headlines. At the private dining area, Jonathan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by investors in dark suits and expensive watches. His smile was sharp, his words rehearsed, but inside, he was wired tight. Every eye on him wasn't just evaluating the numbers, it was evaluating him. And then she walked in. Aaliyah, tray balanced effortlessly, her steps steady even as the room brimmed with tension. She didn't care about billion-dollar deals or whispered power plays. She just wanted to survive her shift without collapsing from exhaustion. But as she leaned in to pour wine into Jonathan's glass, she felt his gaze again, piercing, unblinking. He was supposed to be charming his investors, yet his eyes tracked her every move. Jonathan told himself it was irritation. She had embarrassed him before with her sharp tongue, and his ego wasn't used to bruises. But when she leaned forward, her sleeve shifted just slightly, and for a split second, something caught his eye. A mark. It was faint, just above her wrist, barely visible under the fabric. But Jonathan's eyes locked onto it like a hawk. His chest tightened. He knew shapes, patterns. His memory for detail was unmatched. And this mark wasn't random. It wasn't decorative. It meant something. His investors spoke, pitching numbers, projections, strategies. Jonathan nodded at the right times, played the part of the attentive CEO. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying that glimpse of ink over and over. Could it be? No. Impossible. Aaliyah continued her rounds, unaware of the storm gathering in Jonathan's head. She bent to pour more wine for the guests across the table, her sleeve sliding again just enough for Jonathan to see the faint curve of the design. This time, he was certain. Jonathan's grip tightened on his glass until the stem threatened to snap. He forced his expression neutral, but his pulse pounded in his ears. That mark, he had seen it before. Years ago, in a place where secrets weren't supposed to leave. He stole another glance at her. She was quick, efficient, avoiding unnecessary conversation. But the more he watched, the more he realized she wasn't just a waitress. She was hiding something, and it was connected to him. The investors laughed at a joke he didn't hear. Jonathan forced a chuckle, pretending to follow, while his mind spun faster than any deal on the table. By the time dessert was served, Aaliyah could feel the weight of Jonathan Blake's eyes like a physical touch. Every time she passed his table, every time she leaned in to refill a glass or clear a plate, his gaze followed her, not casually, not with the shallow interest of a man used to getting what he wanted. No, this was sharper, heavier, like he was trying to peel back her skin and see what she was hiding. She kept her face neutral, but inside her chest, her heart thumped against her ribs. She told herself she was imagining it. Men like him didn't look at women like her unless they wanted something fleeting, and she wasn't about to entertain that fantasy. But the whispers confirmed she wasn't imagining anything. At the bar, while she grabbed another bottle of wine, two of her co-workers leaned close. "Why is he staring at you like that?" One whispered, her eyes wide. "Girl, don't play dumb." The other smirked. "That's Jonathan Blake. He could have anyone in this restaurant. And right now, he's looking at you." Aaliyah forced a laugh, pretending not to care. Maybe he's deciding whether to fire me himself. But the unease lingered as she walked back toward the table. Every glance he gave her made her skin prickle, but not for the reasons her co-workers teased about. It wasn't attraction she felt in his gaze. It was recognition, like he knew something about her, something he shouldn't. And then, as she set a plate in front of one of the investors, the corner of her sleeve brushed back again. Her eyes flicked down instinctively. The faintest edge of ink threatened to show, and panic shot through her like ice water. She tugged the sleeve down quickly, praying no one had noticed. But Jonathan had. She could feel it in the way his posture shifted, in the way his fingers tapped the table once, controlled and deliberate. For a split second, Aaliyah's mind wasn't in the restaurant anymore. She was back in that cramped apartment years ago, her best friend's voice whispering as the tattoo needle burned into her skin. "This will protect you. This will remind you." But protect her from what? Remind her of what? The memory blurred at the edges, a mixture of pain and resolve, and Aaliyah blinked hard, forcing herself back to the present. "Miss," one of the investors waved a hand in her face. She plastered on her professional smile. "Yes, sir. Anything else I can get for you?" "Coffee," he said, dismissive, already turning back to Jonathan. Aaliyah walked away quickly, the memory lingering like smoke she couldn't fan away. At the head of the table, Jonathan swirled his wine slowly, eyes narrowed. He said nothing, but in his mind wheels were turning. He didn't believe in coincidences. Not in business, not in life. That mark on her wrist, it was too precise, too familiar. He had seen it in files that were never meant to be public, connected to secrets that could topple empires. And now, here it was, on the skin of a waitress in Manhattan. 2 nights later, the Sterling was buzzing again. Reservations had filled within minutes, once word spread. Jonathan Blake was coming back. Investors assumed it meant another major deal. The staff braced themselves for another exhausting evening. Aaliyah, however, had a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew exactly why Jonathan had returned, and it had nothing to do with business. When he entered, the entire energy of the restaurant shifted. Jonathan wasn't with investors this time. Just him, seated at a corner table with an unobstructed view of the entire floor. It was a calculated move. Jonathan Blake never positioned himself anywhere without intent. And from the moment Aaliyah stepped out of the kitchen with her tray, his eyes locked on her. "Lucky you," her co-worker Marissa whispered with a grin. "You've got his table again." "Unlucky me," Aaliyah muttered, steadying her breath before walking toward him. She set down his glass of wine without waiting for him to order. "Cabernet, your favorite. Saves us both some time." Jonathan smirked. "Efficient. I like that." "I wasn't trying to impress you," she shot back, eyes flicking away. But Jonathan wasn't easily dismissed. "Most people do." She felt his gaze linger as she poured. "Then maybe you need new people." There it was again, the spark, sharp and unspoken, that neither wanted to acknowledge. His arrogance grated against her nerves, but his words carried a curiosity that wasn't entirely hostile. He wasn't treating her like background noise. He was studying her. When she set the bottle down, Jonathan leaned forward. "Tell me something. Aaliyah, what's that you're hiding?" Her hand froze for a fraction of a second, just enough for him to notice. She recovered quickly, forcing a casual shrug. "Excuse me." "That mark," he said softly, voice pitched low so only she could hear. "On your wrist. I've seen it before." Her pulse skipped. She tugged her sleeve down instinctively. "You must be mistaken. I don't know what you're talking about." Jonathan's gaze sharpened, searching her face for cracks. "I don't make mistakes." For a beat, they stared at each other, her dark eyes defiant, his piercing and unrelenting. The hum of the restaurant carried on around them, but at that table, the air was thick with tension. Aaliyah leaned closer, lowering her voice to match his. "If you think I'm just another person you can intimidate, Mr. Blake, you're wrong." Something flickered across his face, not annoyance, not quite admiration, but something in between. He was used to people folding under pressure. She wasn't folding. For a moment, he almost smiled. Almost. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. She stepped back, tray balanced against her hip. "Enjoy your wine, sir." And she walked away. Jonathan's jaw clenched as he watched her retreat. He wasn't used to people walking away. Not when he wanted answers. But Aaliyah had. The Sterling had seen its fair share of drama, celebrity meltdowns, investors shouting matches, even the occasional champagne fight. But that night, the air was charged with a tension that promised something bigger. Jonathan Blake was hosting another dinner, this time with senators and venture capitalists at his table. The stakes were higher than ever. A government contract worth billions hung in the balance. The staff had been warned, no mistakes. Aaliyah had tried to swap tables with another waitress, but management insisted she serve Jonathan's party again. Of course they did, she thought bitterly. The man practically radiated power. Who wouldn't want to cater to him? Everyone but her. She carried the tray with steady hands, but her heart was pounding harder than it should. His eyes found her the second she entered the room, and she could feel their weight pressing down on her. "Careful," Marissa whispered as they passed each other. "That one's watching you again." Aaliyah swallowed hard, focusing on her steps. She approached the table, bending slightly to set a glass of red in front of one of the senators. The tray wobbled just as she turned toward Jonathan, and before she could steady it, the glass tipped. Wine splashed across his immaculate white shirt, staining the fabric a deep crimson. The restaurant froze. Gasps echoed through the room. Forks clattered against plates as every head turned toward the billionaire, with Merlot dripping down his chest. Aaliyah's face drained of color. I'm so sorry." Everyone braced for impact. Jonathan Blake was notorious for his temper. People had been fired, contracts lost, careers destroyed over smaller mistakes. But Jonathan didn't shout. He stood slowly, his chair scraping back across the polished floor. His eyes burned into her as he reached out, not for a napkin, not to push her away, but to grab her wrist. The move was swift, commanding, leaving her breathless. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Enough games." In the scuffle, his thumb brushed against the edge of her sleeve, pushing the fabric just far enough for his skin to graze the tattoo hidden beneath. The contact was brief, but it was enough. Jonathan froze. His grip tightened ever so slightly, his breath catching. His eyes darted to her sleeve, then back to her face. The mask of control he wore so perfectly cracked, just for a heartbeat. Shock, recognition, fury. It flashed across him like lightning, raw and unfiltered. Aaliyah yanked her arm back, tugging her sleeve down before anyone else could see. Her chest heaved as the silence around them thickened, the whole restaurant waiting for Jonathan's eruption. But he said nothing. He just stared at her, jaw clenched, eyes dark, his world shifting in ways no one else at the table could understand. The restaurant had never been quieter. The only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier overhead, and the rapid thud of Aaliyah's heart as Jonathan's grip lingered on her wrist. She had pulled back, tried to retreat, but Jonathan wasn't finished. His chest rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths, the wine dripping down his shirt like blood. The stain spread across the expensive fabric, a grotesque crimson mark that mirrored the rage in his eyes. "Jonathan," one of the senators said awkwardly, shifting in his seat. "Perhaps we should." "Shut up," Jonathan snapped, his voice sharper than glass. Gasps rippled again. Nobody dared breathe. Jonathan's gaze bore into Aaliyah, as if tearing through her layers, ripping away the mask she had so carefully built. His hand shot out again, grabbing the fabric of her sleeve. She struggled, whispering harshly, Don't you dare." But he did. With one violent pull, the sound of tearing fabric ripped through the silence. Her blouse split down the shoulder, across her chest. The delicate cotton gave way with a scream of threads, exposing the dark ink seared into her skin. The tattoo. For a split second, the room was frozen in disbelief. Eyes widened, jaws fell open. Then silence deepened, becoming heavier, darker, as though the walls themselves understood the weight of what had just been revealed. The mark wasn't random. It wasn't artistic. It was infamous. A black and silver emblem, sharp lines crossing like a brand, its edges curling in a symbol too many in power recognized, but dared never speak of. The Blake Corporation's forgotten scandal. Years ago, it had been buried under money, threats, and blood. Whispers of an underground project, experiments, lives destroyed, all linked to Jonathan's rise to power. The emblem was said to belong only to those who had survived it. And there it was, inked into the skin of the waitress nobody noticed. Jonathan's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in public memory, the billionaire looked stripped bare. Not powerful, not untouchable, just exposed. Aaliyah stood frozen, her chest rising in shallow, panicked breaths, the eyes of senators, investors, and staff burning into her. She clutched the torn edges of her blouse, but the damage was done. The symbol was out. The past had surfaced. Then something else happened, something stranger than the silence. Fear spread across the table. Not disgust, not curiosity. Fear. The senators' faces paled. One man reached for his phone, then stopped, trembling. An investor pushed back his chair, as if suddenly unwilling to be at the same table. Because they knew. They recognized the emblem too. And if this waitress was carrying it, alive and breathing in their presence, then the scandal they thought long dead had just clawed its way back into the light. The restaurant was no longer a place of dining. It was a stage, a theater of silence where the walls seemed to lean in, waiting for someone to break it. Aaliyah clutched her torn blouse, trembling, yet her eyes, dark, unblinking, locked onto Jonathan's with a steadiness that made him falter. For once, he was the one cornered. "Where did you get that?" Jonathan's voice cracked through the stillness, low but sharp, like the edge of a blade. Aaliyah's lips parted, her throat dry. She could have lied. She could have denied it, played ignorant, begged for forgiveness. But she didn't. She'd hidden too long, lived in shadows too long. Tonight, the truth demanded light. "You know where I got it," she whispered. Her voice carried, ricocheting off the glass and marble. Every guest leaned in. This mark doesn't belong to the living. It belongs to the lost, to the ones your company left to die. Gasps rolled through the room. Jonathan's jaw clenched. That's not true. But even he didn't sound convinced. Aaliyah's chest rose and fell, and then, like a wound reopening, her story spilled out. I was 19, she began, her voice trembling at first, then sharpening. My brother Marcus had gotten sick, strange seizures, fevers that no doctor could explain. We heard whispers about a trial, some new experimental program that could save him. It was under your brother's division, Jonathan. Daniel Blake's project. Jonathan stiffened at the name. Daniel Blake, his late brother, the golden child, the man whose death was still painted as a tragedy in the media. They told us it was safe. They told us it was hope. Aaliyah continued, her words now slicing through the air like glass. We signed the forms, desperate. Marcus was injected with something I still don't understand. Within a month, he was dead. And me. She pressed her hand to the tattoo, her voice breaking. They branded me before releasing me. Said I was one of the chosen survivors. Said I should be grateful. This tattoo is the proof, the mark of their experiment. Proof that your empire was built on human trials, secrecy, and lies. The investors stared at Jonathan, horror etched across their faces. The senators exchanged nervous glances. Phones buzzed quietly, no doubt texts firing off to reporters and lawyers. Jonathan's mask of arrogance was gone. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table, as though holding himself up. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost to himself. My brother promised me. He promised none of it was real. Aaliyah's eyes burned with unshed tears. It was real. Too real. And now the whole world knows. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Blake wasn't feared, he was finished. But there was one thing left unsaid, hanging like a storm over their heads. Would Jonathan protect Aaliyah now that the truth was out? Or would he destroy her to bury the last link to his family's darkest secret? For a long, unbearable moment, Jonathan Blake didn't move. His hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened, his face a storm of rage, fear, and something no one in that glittering room had ever seen before it out. All eyes were on him. The billionaire, the empire builder, the man who had commanded boardrooms and presidents with a single glance. But tonight, a waitress had stripped him bare in front of the world. Aaliyah stood across from him, blouse torn, chest heaving. Yet she wasn't cowering. For the first time in years, she stood unhidden, unbroken. Her secret was no longer a weight. It was a weapon, and she held it with every ounce of defiance burning in her eyes. You want to protect your empire? She whispered, her voice shaking but strong enough to reach every corner of the hushed restaurant. Then destroy me. End me here. But know this, Jonathan, truth doesn't die. Not anymore. Not with me. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. His investors' eyes screamed for him to act. Silence her. Deny it. Crush her now before it spreads. He could see the headlines already. The collapse of Blake Technologies. The fall of everything he had clawed to build. And then he laughed. A low, broken laugh that startled even himself. It wasn't arrogance. Not this time. It was something else. Resignation. Almost relief. I spent my whole life trying to clean up Daniel's mess, Jonathan said, his voice carrying a strange calm. Burying secrets. Buying silence. Living with ghosts. And you. He looked at Aaliyah. Really looked at her. You're the proof I never wanted to find. The ghost I couldn't pay off. He stepped forward, close enough that the room leaned in, waiting for violence. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, palms open, as if surrendering. She's telling the truth, Jonathan said. Gasps shattered the silence. Investors surged from their seats, shouting. One man yelled, "You'll ruin us." Another woman snapped, "Do you realize what you've done?" But Jonathan didn't flinch. He turned toward Aaliyah, his jaw tight, but his eyes softer than she expected. I won't destroy you. Not after everything my family destroyed already. If my empire burns, it burns with the truth, not lies. And that's when chaos broke loose. Phones came out, recording. Senators shouted into calls, demanding statements. Investors stormed toward the exits, their empire unraveling in real time. The restaurant that had been silent now roared with panicked voices, cameras flashing, chairs scraping. But in the middle of it all, Aaliyah stood tall, blouse torn but spirit whole, and Jonathan stood beside her, not as her enemy, but as the man who had finally chosen truth over power. The restaurant's silence had been broken, not with applause, not with relief, but with chaos, the kind that signals the world will never be the same again. And over that chaos, one truth rang louder than all the rest. When power meets truth, the world stops to listen. But in the silence, the real story begins.